The morning sun was just rising over the quiet town. The streets were mostly empty except for a few shopkeepers setting up their stalls and children waiting for their school bus. Among them walked a man in a neatly pressed uniform, his badge shining under the soft light. He was the kind of officer everyone knew but never feared. People greeted him with warm smiles, and he always returned them with the same calm expression. He wasn't the loud or showy kind of person. He believed in quiet work, in doing the right thing even when nobody was watching. He had been serving in the police department for almost 10 years. In that time, he had seen both good and bad sides of his job. He had met people who inspired him and others who disappointed him deeply. But through it all, one thing never changed: his belief that justice mattered. It wasn't about medals or promotions. It was about helping people feel safe. That morning, as he walked into the station with his cup of coffee, he didn't know his day would change his life forever. At the station, the mood was like any other day. Officers joked around, phones rang, and paperwork piled up on desks. But something unusual caught his attention. A file on his desk marked "Confidential." It was from a case he hadn't heard of before. When he opened it, he found reports about a construction company in town that had received government contracts worth millions. The company was supposed to build housing for low-income families, but only half the work had been completed. The rest of the money had disappeared. He frowned as he read through the documents. The reports were incomplete and some pages were missing. There were no signatures from supervisors, no follow-up reports, nothing. It looked like someone had tried to bury the case quietly. He asked one of his colleagues about it, but the man just shrugged and said, "That's above our level. Don't bother with it." Something in that answer didn't sit right with him. Why would anyone want to ignore a case involving public money, meant for families who needed homes? He decided to visit the construction site himself. The place looked abandoned. Half-built walls, broken cement bags, and rusting machinery lying around. A few workers stood nearby, smoking and chatting. When he approached them, they looked uneasy. One of them finally said, "We haven't been paid for months. The boss just stopped showing up." The man's eyes shifted nervously as if afraid someone might hear him. The officer took notes quietly. The workers told him the company's owner had close ties with some local officials. They had complained before, but no one had listened. Every time they tried to raise their voices, someone came and warned them to stop talking. That was enough for him to realize this was no ordinary case. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Back at the station, he began looking deeper. He checked city records, financial reports, and old files. He noticed patterns that didn't make sense. Large sums of money moved through fake accounts, approvals signed on dates when officials were out of town, and even some documents with forged signatures. The deeper he looked, the stranger it got. One afternoon, his superior officer called him into the office. The door closed behind him and the air suddenly felt heavy. "I heard you've been asking questions," his senior said, leaning back in the chair. "That case is sensitive. You're not supposed to handle it." The officer kept his voice steady as he replied, "Sir, it looks like there's a lot of missing information. I just want to know what really happened." His senior smiled slightly and said, "Some things are better left alone. Focus on your assigned duties." It was a warning, but he couldn't ignore his conscience. That night he sat in his small apartment going over the files again. His wife noticed the worry on his face and asked if something was wrong. He just smiled faintly and said, "Nothing serious, just work." But deep inside he knew it wasn't nothing. It was the start of something that could either expose the truth or destroy his career. Days passed and the pressure around him started to grow. He found that certain files he had copied were suddenly missing from the office computer. When he asked about them, no one knew anything. The technician told him the system might have automatically deleted the data. It was an excuse he didn't believe. Someone didn't want him to see those files again. Still, he didn't stop. He began meeting people quietly after work. Former employees of the construction company, local residents, even a few officers who had left the department. They all had pieces of the puzzle. One of them, a young man who used to deliver materials to the site, said he once saw envelopes of cash being exchanged late at night. He didn't know who was involved, but he recognized a car that belonged to a senior official. Hearing that made his heart race. If that was true, it meant the corruption reached higher than he thought. He wrote everything down carefully and kept a separate notebook hidden at home. He didn't want to trust anyone in the department yet. One night while driving home, he noticed a black car following him. Every time he turned, the car did too. His instincts kicked in. He made a few quick turns through side streets until the car sped away. That's when he knew for sure someone was watching him. He didn't tell anyone about it, not even his wife. He didn't want to scare her. But from that night on, he became more careful. He checked his surroundings, avoided predictable routes, and kept copies of every piece of evidence he found. At work, people started treating him differently. Some avoided him altogether, pretending to be busy when he walked by. Others whispered behind his back. He could feel the tension, but he didn't show it. He kept doing his job as if nothing had changed. Inside, though, he felt the weight of isolation. It's hard when the people you trust begin to turn away from you. Despite everything, there were still moments that kept him going. One day, an elderly woman came to the station to thank him. She said her son had been one of the workers who lost his job because of the failed project. "People like you still give us hope," she said softly. Her eyes filled with gratitude. That simple moment reminded him why he became an officer, to protect those who couldn't fight for themselves. That night, as he stood by the window of his small apartment, he looked out at the sleeping town. The streetlights flickered and a soft breeze moved through the trees. He thought about everything he had seen in the past few weeks, the lies, the fear, the warnings. He could feel that the truth was close, just hidden behind walls built by people who wanted to keep their power. He wasn't sure where this path would lead him, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stop now. He whispered to himself, "If I walk away now, I'll never forgive myself." The next morning, he woke up early, put on his uniform, and walked out the door with a calm but determined look. The day was quiet again, but he could feel that silence hiding something dangerous underneath. He didn't know it yet, but the journey he had begun would test every bit of courage and strength inside him. Still, he walked forward, one step at a time, ready to face whatever came next. The next few days felt heavy. The officer could sense that things around him were slowly changing. When he entered the station, conversations would suddenly stop. People avoided his eyes, and some gave him quick, nervous glances. It was clear that word had spread about his private investigation. He tried to act normal, but deep down he knew he was walking on thin ice. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Every night after his shift, he sat at his small kitchen table, papers scattered everywhere, a cup of cold tea beside him. He studied every document, every number, and every signature. The pattern was becoming clearer. The construction company had been receiving fake approvals from city officials. Permits were signed by people who didn't even exist. Some accounts were traced to offshore banks. It wasn't just carelessness, it was planned theft. One afternoon, he decided to visit the city office to check old permit records. The woman at the counter looked uncomfortable when he mentioned the construction project. "Those files are restricted," she said quickly. "Only senior officials can access them." When he asked who had that permission, she hesitated before whispering a name he recognized. A powerful man in town known for his wealth and influence. The officer thanked her and walked out quietly, his mind racing. That night he couldn't sleep. The same thought kept circling in his mind. If he went further, he might lose everything. His job, his safety, even his family's peace. But if he stopped now, he'd be no different from those who looked the other way. He stared at the ceiling and whispered to himself, "The truth is worth it." The next day, he requested a meeting with his senior officer again. When he entered the office, the senior didn't look happy. "You again?" he said sharply. "Didn't I tell you to stay out of this?" The officer placed a few printed documents on the desk and said calmly, "I found records showing forged signatures and missing permits. We need to investigate this properly." The senior officer's face tightened. He stood up slowly and said in a low voice, "You're walking a dangerous line. There are things in this department you don't understand. If you keep digging, you'll regret it." That was the moment the officer realized the corruption wasn't just outside. It was inside the force too. The people who were supposed to protect the law were breaking it themselves. He walked out of the office quietly, but inside anger and disappointment burned like fire. He had always believed that justice began with the badge. Now that belief felt broken. Later that week, he received an anonymous envelope at his desk. Inside were photographs, grainy, taken at night, showing a meeting between the construction company's owner and two government officials. The back of one photo had a short message. They meet every Thursday at the old warehouse near the docks. There was no name, no signature, nothing else. He wasn't sure if it was a trap, but he couldn't ignore it. That Thursday, he parked his car a few blocks away from the warehouse and waited in the shadows. Around midnight, a black SUV pulled up and 3 men stepped out. One of them was indeed the company owner. The other 2 looked like city officials. They carried briefcases and spoke in low voices. The officer couldn't hear what they were saying, but he took photos quietly with his phone. When one of the men turned suddenly, he ducked behind a pile of crates, his heart pounding. The meeting lasted only 10 minutes, but that was enough to confirm what he already suspected. He drove home with shaky hands, the pictures safe in his pocket. He now had proof, but also a new problem. If he turned the evidence in, it would go through the same corrupt hands that might destroy it. He needed to find someone outside the system, someone he could trust. That's when he remembered an old friend, a journalist who had once covered stories about police reforms. They hadn't spoken in years, but he decided to take the risk. The next evening, they met quietly in a small cafe far from town. The journalist listened carefully as the officer explained everything and showed the photos. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then the journalist said softly, "You're doing the right thing, but you need to be careful. These people don't play fair." They agreed to work together. The officer would collect information, and the journalist would verify it through her contacts. They both knew this was dangerous, but neither of them backed away. Over the next few weeks, they met secretly at different places, sometimes in crowded markets, sometimes at empty parking lots. Each meeting brought new evidence, bank records, signed contracts, hidden payments. Slowly, the puzzle was coming together. But as the truth got closer, so did the danger. One night, the officer returned home to find his apartment door slightly open. His stomach tightened. Inside, everything looked normal, until he saw that his drawer had been opened and the notebook where he kept his notes was missing. He searched the whole place, but it was gone. That notebook had details that could expose everything. Someone had been inside and they knew exactly what to take. He didn't call the station to report it. He knew that whoever broke in might have connections inside the department. Instead, he called the journalist. "They know," he said quietly. "They've started watching me." She told him to stay calm and to keep multiple copies of his evidence hidden in safe places. He followed her advice, storing data on separate drives and leaving one copy with her. The next few days were full of tension. He noticed strange cars parked near his house and unfamiliar faces in the crowd when he went to work. Once, as he was leaving the station, a voice behind him muttered, "You should have listened when you had the chance." When he turned around, no one was there. The word stayed with him all night. His wife began noticing the stress in his eyes. She asked if he wanted to take a break, maybe go out of town for a few days. He shook his head. "If I leave now, they win," he said softly. "And this town doesn't deserve that." She didn't argue, but the worry in her eyes said everything. One evening, while reviewing files, he received a message on his phone. It was from an unknown number. "Stop now. Last warning." His hands froze for a moment. He deleted the message and took a deep breath. The threats were real, but so was his determination. He told himself that truth always costs something, and maybe this was his price to pay. Then came the twist he didn't expect. His superior officer called him again, this time with a softer tone. "Look," the man said, "I can help you. But you need to back off publicly. We'll handle the case quietly." It sounded like an offer of peace, but the officer knew better. If he stepped back now, everything would vanish again, buried under silence. He nodded politely, but in his heart he had already made his decision. That night he met the journalist again and handed over the last batch of documents. "This is everything I have," he said. "If anything happens to me, promise me you'll tell the world." She looked at him with a mix of respect and fear and nodded. When he returned home, the streets were quiet, the moonlight spilling across the road. He felt tired but strangely at peace. He knew he was up against something bigger than himself, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. The truth was finally taking shape, and no matter what happened next, he had already crossed the point of no return. He looked out the window and whispered, "They think fear will stop me. But they don't understand I didn't choose this fight for myself. I chose it for what's right." The night was calm, but inside him burned a steady fire, the kind that doesn't fade easily no matter how dark the world becomes. The next few weeks were some of the hardest days the officer had ever faced. His phone barely stopped ringing, but most of the calls were from unknown numbers that hung up as soon as he answered. His wife had grown quieter too. She had stopped asking questions, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Every time he stepped out of the house, she would stand by the window until he disappeared around the corner. She feared something might happen, and truthfully, so did he. But there was no turning back now. At the station, things had changed completely. The same people who once laughed with him during breaks now acted like he didn't exist. His desk was moved to a corner, far from the rest. Every assignment he was given seemed pointless. Simple paperwork, traffic reports, anything to keep him busy and out of the way. It was clear they were trying to isolate him. The message was loud and clear: stop digging, but he didn't stop. He continued meeting the journalist secretly, gathering evidence, checking every lead. One evening, she told him that the story was almost ready to go public. They just needed one last piece: proof that someone inside the department had approved the fake contracts. That would tie everything together. The officer nodded. "Leave that part to me," he said. He knew where to find it. Late that night, after everyone had left the station, he returned to the records room. The air smelled of dust and old paper. He went through the locked cabinet with shaky hands until he found what he was looking for: files with the official seals and signatures. As he flipped through the pages, his heart sank. The approvals were indeed signed by someone from inside the department. Someone high-ranking, someone he once looked up to, his own senior officer. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the signature. It felt like the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. The person who had trained him, who taught him what it meant to wear the badge, was part of the very corruption he had been fighting. He quietly took copies of the files and placed them in his bag. But as he was leaving, he heard footsteps. Someone else was in the building. He quickly hid behind a shelf and waited. The sound came closer, then stopped right outside the room. After a few seconds, the door opened slightly, and a beam of light swept across the floor. He held his breath. Finally, the door shut again, and the footsteps faded away. He waited another minute before slipping out quietly. That night, he couldn't sleep. The betrayal was too heavy. The next morning, he tried to act normal, but the tension inside him was visible. His senior called him into the office again. "You've been busy," the man said with a cold smile. "You're making people nervous. Maybe you should take some time off." The officer looked at him and replied calmly, "You mean stop asking questions?" His senior leaned back and said, "I mean stop before you destroy your own career." The officer walked out without saying another word. That conversation confirmed everything. The people at the top weren't just aware, they were protecting themselves. He had no one left to rely on inside the department. The only person he could trust now was the journalist. When they met later that evening, he gave her the documents. "This is the final piece," he said quietly. She looked through them, her expression turning serious. "This changes everything," she whispered. But before they could discuss it further, she received a message from her editor saying they should wait before publishing. The editor had received a warning from someone powerful. It seemed like even the media was under pressure now. The officer clenched his fists. "They're everywhere," he said. "Every system, every person, they've got someone on their side." The journalist nodded slowly. "That's why your story matters. It's not just about the money. It's about courage. People have forgotten what that looks like." As the days went on, the pressure became unbearable. He was called to the department's internal review board, where they accused him of unauthorized investigations and misuse of office time. They even hinted that he could be suspended. He tried to explain that he was investigating real corruption, but they cut him off. "You've crossed the line," one of the officials said. "You're becoming a problem for the department." He walked out of that meeting feeling both angry and helpless. It was unfair, but he knew they were trying to silence him. Later that night, he received another anonymous message. "Stop before you lose everything." This time, he didn't even flinch. He just deleted it and went back to his notes. Fear had stopped controlling him. He had already lost the comfort of safety, but he hadn't lost his sense of purpose. One evening, while driving home, a car sped past him and blocked his way. Two men stepped out, their faces hidden under caps. They didn't say a word, just stared at him for a few seconds before walking away. It was a silent warning, but it told him everything. He was being watched closely now. He parked his car a few streets away and walked the rest of the way home. When he entered his house, his wife could tell something had happened. "It's getting dangerous, isn't it?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. After a moment, he said, "It was always dangerous. I just didn't see it before." Despite the fear, he refused to give in. He started making backup copies of every file and stored them in different places, one with the journalist, one in a trusted lawyer's office, and one hidden at home. He knew that if anything happened to him, the truth would still come out. A week later, his suspension letter arrived. The official reason was misconduct and insubordination. He read it slowly, then placed it on the table. His wife looked at him with tears in her eyes, but he smiled faintly. "They think this will stop me," he said. "But they just gave me more time to finish what I started." Now that he was no longer bound by duty hours, he and the journalist worked non-stop. They tracked down witnesses, including a few former employees who were willing to speak off record. One of them revealed that the missing funds were transferred through a fake charity organization. The officer followed the trail until he uncovered a connection between that charity and the same officials from the warehouse meetings. Every piece fit perfectly now, but something unexpected happened. One night, the journalist called him in a panic. "Someone followed me," she said. "They know I'm working with you." He told her to stay at a friend's place for a few days while he handled the rest. He didn't want her to get hurt because of him. That night, sitting alone in his dark living room, he thought about everything he had risked: his job, his safety, his family's peace. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was it worth it? What if nothing changed? What if the truth never reached the public? But then he remembered the workers who never got paid, the families who never got their homes, and the elderly woman who thanked him for not giving up. That memory gave him strength. He spent the next morning organizing all the evidence in a single file. He labeled it carefully and sealed it in a brown envelope. Then he wrote a short note. "If anything happens to me, this must reach the public." He left the note inside his desk drawer at home. He didn't plan on dying, but he wanted to be ready for anything. By evening, he met the journalist one last time before she left town. "Take care of yourself," she said. He nodded. "We're almost there," he replied. They both knew the coming days would be critical. The story was almost ready to go public, and once it did, there would be no going back for either of them. When he walked home that night, the air was cold, and the streets were empty. He felt a strange calmness inside him. It wasn't the calm of safety. It was the calm of someone who had accepted the storm ahead. He knew the people he was fighting had power, but he had something stronger: truth and the courage to stand by it. As he reached his house, he paused for a moment before stepping inside. He looked up at the sky and whispered quietly, "Whatever comes next, I'm ready." He didn't know that the hardest part of his journey was just about to begin. But for now, he allowed himself a small moment of peace, knowing that he had not backed down, even when the world turned against him. The news of his suspension spread quickly through the small town. Some people whispered that he had finally gone too far, while others quietly admired his courage but were too afraid to say it out loud. He could feel the shift everywhere he went, at the grocery store, the market, even when walking down the street. Some avoided eye contact, others nodded with quiet respect. But for him, the noise didn't matter. His only focus was finishing what he had started. Each morning he woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat by the table covered in papers and files. His home had turned into a small investigation office. The walls were pinned with notes, names, and dates. He no longer wore his uniform, but in his heart he still felt like an officer. The badge might have been taken away, but the responsibility to seek justice remained. He had promised himself that until the truth was out, he wouldn't rest. The journalist he had been working with had gone into hiding for safety. They communicated only through secure messages now. Every time she texted, she used different numbers. "We're almost there," she wrote one evening. "But they're getting desperate. They're trying to find us." He knew what that meant. It was only a matter of time before the people behind the corruption tried to silence them for good. He made sure all his evidence was stored in multiple places. One copy hidden in a locker, another sent to a lawyer, and the most important one given to a trusted contact in another city. That way, even if something happened to him, the truth would survive. One afternoon, he was walking through the town square when a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see one of his old colleagues from the department. The man looked nervous as he approached. "You need to stop," he whispered quickly. "They're planning something. Just stay quiet for a while." The officer frowned. "Who's planning what?" But the man shook his head. "I can't say more. Just please be careful," he said before walking away. That warning stayed in his mind all day. He couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that something bad was coming. That night he noticed a car parked across the street from his house. The same car was there the next night too. Its headlights were off and the driver never got out. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't want to worry her. But he started sleeping lightly, waking up at every little sound. A few days later, the journalist called him through a secure line. "I have everything ready," she said. "The report is complete. We'll release it next week." He felt relief flood through him. "Once it's out, they won't be able to hide anymore," he said. But she sounded worried. "They know, and they're watching closely. Be ready for anything." He promised her he would be careful, though deep down he knew danger was closing in. That evening, as he drove back home, a truck suddenly swerved in front of him. He barely managed to stop in time. The driver looked at him, then sped away without saying a word. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. It wasn't an accident. It was a warning. He sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, then whispered to himself, "They can scare me, but they can't break me." The following days felt long and tense. He tried to keep a low profile, but his mind never stopped working. He wrote down every detail of his investigation in a journal. Names, places, conversations, everything he remembered. He didn't know who might need it later, but he wanted to make sure no piece of truth would be lost. Then one morning, a letter arrived at his door. There was no sender's name, only a single line inside. "You've been warned enough." He folded the letter quietly, burned it, and flushed the ashes down the sink. He wasn't going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing his fear. But inside, he knew things were reaching a breaking point. The journalist finally sent him a message. "Tomorrow morning it goes public." That night, he didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window staring at the dark sky. Every sound outside made him alert. He thought about his journey, how it all started with one suspicious file, one small question that nobody wanted answered. He never expected it to go this far, but he also knew that some truths demanded a fight. As the first light of morning touched the sky, he whispered, "It's time." The news broke around noon. The journalist's report appeared on every major outlet across the region. It exposed everything: the corruption, the fake contracts, the secret meetings, the forged documents. Names were named, and the evidence was undeniable. The people who had once ignored him were now in shock. The town was buzzing with the news. Some couldn't believe it. Others felt angry for having been lied to for so long. Within hours, the department went into chaos. High-ranking officials tried to deny everything, calling it false reporting, but the documents spoke for themselves. Investigators from outside the town arrived to verify the claims. For the first time in months, the officer felt a weight lifting off his chest. The truth was finally out. But his relief didn't last long. That same evening, he received a call from a private number. The voice on the other end was cold and calm. "You think this is over?" the man said. "You've made powerful enemies. Don't celebrate too soon." Then the line went dead. The officer sat in silence for a long time, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. By the next morning, reporters had gathered outside his house. They wanted interviews, photos, quotes, but he didn't speak to any of them. He wasn't doing this for fame or recognition. He only wanted justice. So instead, he stayed home, watching quietly as the truth rippled through the media. Soon the arrests began. One by one, officials connected to the scandal were taken in for questioning. Some denied involvement, others tried to make deals, but the evidence was too strong. When news broke that his former senior officer was among those under investigation, he felt a strange mix of sadness and closure. The man had once been his mentor. Now he was just another name on the list of the corrupt. As days passed, people began reaching out to him. Strangers wrote letters thanking him for standing up when no one else would. Shopkeepers smiled when they saw him. A few officers, once distant, quietly shook his hand and said, "You did what we couldn't." He appreciated it, but he didn't feel like a hero. In his mind, he had only done what was right. However, the price he paid was still heavy. He had lost his job, many friends, and the trust of his department. Even now, he knew some people still wanted revenge. But when he looked at the faces of ordinary people who finally felt safe to speak out, he knew it had been worth it. One evening, he walked to the same abandoned construction site where it all began. The air was still, and the half-built structures stood as reminders of everything he had fought for. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The silence didn't feel empty anymore, it felt peaceful. This was the place where the truth had first whispered to him, asking to be heard, and he had listened. Later that night, he wrote in his journal one last time, "Justice is not about power. It's about courage. Sometimes it costs everything, but if no one stands up, nothing changes." He closed the book and placed it in a drawer. For the first time in months, he went to bed without fear in his heart. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe more challenges, maybe new threats. But he had already faced the worst and come out stronger. And though the fight had taken much from him, it had given him something greater, the peace of knowing he had stayed true to himself. Outside, the night was calm again. The town was sleeping, unaware of how close it had come to being silenced forever. And in one small house, a man who had lost everything but his integrity finally allowed himself to rest, knowing he had refused to back down when it mattered most. Months had passed since the report came out. The town was slowly healing from the shock. Corruption cases were being processed, and new officers were appointed to clean up the department's reputation. The man who had once been seen as a troublemaker was now quietly respected by many, though he didn't crave attention. He preferred silence now, the kind that allowed him to think, to breathe, and to live without fear. His days had grown simple. Every morning he woke before sunrise, took a walk through the quiet streets, and watched the town come alive. The market vendors setting up stalls, kids running to school, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. It reminded him why he had done it all. Not for power or pride, but for these people, for their right to live in a place where truth mattered. Yet deep down, he knew it wasn't truly over. Justice had started, yes, but the system still had cracks. There were people who had escaped punishment, and others who were trying to rebuild their influence in the shadows. The fight for honesty was not a single battle, it was a lifelong one. One morning, as he sat in a small tea shop reading the newspaper, a young officer approached him. The young man looked nervous but determined. "Sir," he said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. What you did, it inspired people like me. I joined the force because I want to serve honestly. But it's not easy." He looked up at the young man and smiled faintly. "It never is," he replied. "But if it were easy, everyone would do it." The young officer nodded, his eyes full of admiration. "How did you keep going when everyone turned against you?" he asked. The older man thought for a moment before answering, "Because I couldn't look away. Once you know the truth, pretending you don't is the same as lying." The young officer nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "I'll remember that," he said before leaving. Watching him walk away, the man felt a quiet sense of hope. Maybe that's how change really started. Not with loud speeches or protests, but with one honest person inspiring another. In the afternoons, he had started volunteering at a local youth center. He didn't tell them who he was or what he had done. To them, he was just a kind man who taught lessons about discipline and honesty. The kids liked him. They would crowd around asking questions about his old days in uniform. Sometimes he'd tell them stories, not the dark ones, but the ones that taught courage, loyalty, and kindness. He often reminded them, "Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you act even when you are." The kids listened wide-eyed as he spoke. He could see their minds working, imagining a future where they could stand tall too. But despite the calmness, the past still had its shadows. One evening, as he returned home, he noticed a car parked outside his house again. It wasn't the same one as before, but the feeling was familiar. He stood there for a few seconds, then walked straight toward it. The window rolled down, and a man inside said quietly, "They haven't forgotten you." He looked at the man carefully. "Neither have I," he replied. The car drove away without another word. He didn't panic this time. Fear had lost its power over him. He knew that as long as truth existed, there would always be people trying to bury it and people like him to dig it back up. Later that night, he sat at his desk, flipping through his old journal. The pages were filled with notes, thoughts, and small reminders of everything he had gone through. On one of the last pages, he found a message he had written to himself months earlier. "When the noise fades, remember why you started." He smiled as he read it. It was a reminder that purpose doesn't vanish even when the storm is over. One weekend, the journalist who had helped him contacted him again. She wanted to meet after all this time. They met at a quiet roadside cafe away from the city. She looked tired but relieved. "You were right," she said. "They tried to bury the story again, but too many people are watching now. It can't be hidden anymore." He nodded slowly. "The truth always finds a way," he said. She smiled. "You know, people still talk about you. Some say you're a hero." He chuckled softly. "Heroes don't get suspended, remember?" She laughed, shaking her head. "Maybe they do. Maybe that's what makes them real." They sat there for a while, sipping tea, talking about how much had changed. Before leaving, she asked him, "If you had the chance to go back in time, would you still do it all again?" He thought about it carefully, then answered, "Yes, I'd do it all again. But I'd be smarter, and maybe kinder to myself along the way." That night, as he walked home under the streetlights, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Not the loud kind that came from applause, but the kind that came from peace. He had lost a lot, but he had gained something much deeper, a sense of purpose that no one could take away. In the following weeks, he was invited by a community organization to speak at a seminar about honesty in public service. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't used to crowds or attention anymore. But something inside him told him to go. On the day of the event, the hall was filled with students, officers, and locals. When he walked onto the stage, the room went silent. He took a deep breath and began, "I'm not here to talk about corruption. You already know what that looks like. I'm here to talk about choices. Every day, each of us faces a choice to speak up or stay silent, to do what's easy or what's right. I didn't always choose right. But the day I did, everything changed." The crowd listened quietly as he spoke, his words simple and real. The world doesn't change because of big speeches. It changes because someone somewhere decides not to give up. Maybe that someone is sitting in this room today. When he finished, the audience stood and clapped, not out of obligation, but because they felt his words. He stepped down quietly, not wanting the spotlight. But in that moment, he knew he had done something meaningful again. After the event, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes. She said her brother had once faced a similar situation and lost hope. "If he could hear you today," she said softly, "he'd believe again." He smiled gently and said, "Then tell him not to stop believing. It's never too late to start over." Weeks turned into months and life continued with its quiet rhythm. The world didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still problems, still people trying to bend the truth. But things were better a little at a time. People had started asking questions, demanding answers, and that was progress. One evening, while watching the sunset from his porch, he thought about everything that had happened. He remembered the fear, the losses, the sleepless nights, but also the moments of courage, the people who had stood by him, and the hope that had kept him going. He realized something important then. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't in winning the fight, but in refusing to give up. A light breeze passed through the trees, and for the first time in a long while he felt free. He had done his part. The rest was up to others now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he whispered softly to himself, "The truth doesn't need heroes. It just needs people who care enough to stand up." And with that, he closed his eyes, letting the peaceful silence settle around him. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same heart that had carried him through everything. Steady, honest, and unbroken.